All around the world, there's been an increase in the practice of spiritism, fortune-telling, witchcraft, and Satanism. This video seeks both to warn and inform the viewer about the possible dangers of any involvement with the occult.
Hey, you know, it's incredible, isn't it, the amount of people we've actually met along the way who've needed to have been set free from involvement in the occult and other practices.
Getting involved can open up doorways for spirit beings to harm and oppress us.
This story really begins with an unremarkable couple from a small village in Bedfordshire that few of you will likely have heard of. Their names were Horace and Madge Groom, and they were full of guilt. Their local church had been abandoned many years ago, with a new church set up closer to the village. But the graveyard had remained. So when an especially brutal winter set in late 1962, the old church was cut off from the community. At the top of a hill, up a muddy path that was virtually inaccessible due to the heavy snow. For months, the graves were left unattended, loved ones left unvisited during the Christmas period. But as soon as the first warm sun rays of spring began to hit, and the snow slowly began to melt away, the grooms took their moment to head up there and visit their relatives, with the intention of cleaning up any mess caused by the long winter. It was late afternoon, on Saturday the 16th of March, when they arrived in the south graveyard to pay their respects. At the same time, they glanced up at what now remained of the once beloved St. Mary's Church, now just a shadow of its former self, its walls cracked and broken, its roof stolen by thieves. What was once a monument to the community's faith in God was now just an empty shell. But then they realised they weren't alone. They could hear something. They paused as the cool spring breeze brought to their ears the gentle laughter of children. The grooms finished up what they were doing and went to the other side of the church to see who was there. From a distance they noticed two small boys sitting on the floor. The couple approached them, and as they did, they realised they weren't local. They didn't recognise either of them, but they seemed to be playing with something. The couple's first instinct was that the kids had pulled something from one of the graves, or the church itself, and they rushed over to make sure these two children weren't vandalising the church. But then, they froze in their tracks. Madge Groom took in a short, sharp intake of breath in shock. The two boys turned around and stopped laughing, realising they were no longer alone. That was when the grooms got their first good look at what the children were playing with. It was a human skull. No one who stood outside the church that day knew what they had just set in motion. A discovery had been made that pointed to there being something very dark going on in the shadows of this idyllic, rural area. This is a tale of ancient rituals, a cursed priest, of ghosts, of conspiracy, of high strangeness, and even murder. A tale that saw a priest driven into exile and made an entire country believe that there were people out there practicing something dark, something they didn't quite understand. This case feels like something ripped straight from the plot of a folk horror tale, but seemingly it all really happened. Get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. We've got quite the rabbit hole to go down tonight. This is the case of the Black Magic Church of Clophill. Welcome to the Tape Library. Just a few bits of housekeeping before we begin. I want to take a moment to welcome our sponsor for this episode, Manta Sleep. If you are a long-time listener of the Tape Library, you will know that Manta has been supporting the show for a few years now. We've continued working together because I genuinely love their products. They have a wide range of high-quality, extremely comfortable sleep masks and other sleep-related products. I'm really fussy about sleep masks, and despite multiple attempts, I could never get on with them. but Manta Sleep's masks have really worked for me. I really like the different options they have to try and provide something for everyone. If you want a recommendation, their Sound 2 mask is the best of the bunch in my opinion, and has the added benefit of having razor-thin Bluetooth speakers either side. You barely notice they are there, and they are perfect for falling asleep listening to spooky stories. I've also just got hold of their white noise machine, so I'm going to be giving that a try in the next few weeks. I'll let you guys know what I think of it very soon. Use the link below or the code TAPE at checkout to get 10% off your order and support the show. Thank you to Manta Sleep for their continued support. I'm here every couple of weeks bringing you real life cases of the strange and the unexplained, so if you want to hear more, please be sure to subscribe. Just to pre-warn you, this episode does contain brief references to a number of topics that might be upsetting to some, including sexual assault and animal cruelty. So if you're particularly sensitive to conversations about these topics, it might be worth skipping this one. With that out of the way, let's begin tonight's story. To tell the story of Clophill, we first have to look at the history of two different elements of this story that were unknowingly on a collision course with one another. The first is the church itself. There are many rumours as to why the old St. Mary's Church was located where it was, around half a mile away from the village. There were rumours of it being used to house those suffering from leprosy, that it was previously a site of great interest to the pagans, that the church was even constructed the wrong way round, suggesting this meant it faced the devil and not God. But seemingly none of this is true, or at least we have no evidence that this is the case. Built in the 15th century, the church was used largely without issue, right into the 1800s. But as the population of the village of Clophill grew and grew, the church was slowly starting to be seen as not fit for purpose. For years, discussions were had about building another, and in 1849, a new St. Mary's Church was built in the village itself. However, the graveyard was left where it was, and the old church was used for funeral services, as well as for some reason a single annual congregation in August. For the most part, nothing much happened with the old church for the next 100 years. Although in the early parts of the 20th century, we can find a handful of references to the fact that the old graveyard had developed a reputation for being the target of body snatchers, and that human remains had been dug up on numerous occasions, and remains found in nearby farm fields. This was later explained away by the fact the graveyard once occupied a much larger area than it now did, and these remains were simply the result of farmland springing up over the site of former graves. However, others claimed that people were digging up the graves to steal valuables like jewellery. No official cases of this have been documented though, seemingly. But with what was to come later, you have to wonder if the site maybe had a much longer hidden history that hasn't been documented. The true end for the church came in 1956, when thieves made off with large portions of the church roof, taking the large lead sheets to sell. Now, beyond those who came to visit the graves, the church itself was truly abandoned. The rector at that time attempted to spread a rumour that the church was haunted, seemingly an attempt to scare away any further vandals. It did not work. The other oncoming element to this story is the tale of Reverend Lewis Barker. Barker had come to the village of Clophill to become the rector in 1962, and had arrived a fairly damaged man himself. Barker had been married in 1932, but by 1955 he was divorced. His wife, who it was suggested had already been struggling with some mental health issues, took the breakup of their family badly, taking her own life in 1958. He took some time away from the church and travelled to Africa. But just a few years later he returned ready to work, and was sent to take over Clophill. Numerous references have been made over the years that Reverend Barker seemingly had a drinking problem, but he was widely liked by the community of Clophill and welcomed in quickly. But it wasn't just Reverend Barker who was coming into this period with a dark shadow hanging over him. Just 1 year prior to his arrival, a terrible crime had been committed just outside of the village that brought the area into the public eye. Known widely as the A6 murder, the attack took place on a stretch of road just outside the village, at a spot known as Dead Man's Hill, for its history of once being the home of gallows. The case would lead to a conviction and execution of James Hanratty, but questions about what really happened that night have persisted for decades. A 36-year-old man named Michael Gregston was parked in a quiet cornfield with Valerie Story in Buckinghamshire when suddenly a man tapped on their window. The couple were shocked but very quickly realised the danger they were in when the man in the field revealed a revolver and forced his way into the car. Throughout the course of the night, this unknown man forced them to drive across North London and through numerous towns and cities before turning towards Bedford. At around 3 AM, once they had just passed Clophill, the gunman ordered Michael to stop the car in a lay-by. As soon as they stopped, the gunman fired 2 shots at point blank, killing Michael. He then sexually assaulted Valerie, forced her to drag Michael's body out into the road, before shooting her 5 times and leaving her at the roadside. Incredibly, Valerie survived. She played dead until Hanratty left, then waved down a passing car before immediately passing out. She lived, although paralysed for life. She quickly identified James Hanratty as the man who had kidnapped them, as did other witnesses, and Hanratty was hanged in April of 1962, one of the last people to face this punishment in the UK. Due to the general public outcry towards capital punishment at the time, numerous people argued that this case was controversial and that Hanratty was innocent, although in the last few decades it has been proven he was the murderer through DNA evidence. The other key suspect was a man named Peter Lewis Alphon, an eccentric drifter who admitted to the crime despite Valerie not recognising him at all. What is more interesting for the rest of tonight's episode is that Alphon was also interested in the world of witchcraft and black magic. Of course, this was the 1960s, so he wouldn't be alone.
Do you regard black magic as being purely fictitious, or is there some truth in it?
Some truth. 100% truth. There is nothing fictitious about black magic, in any way whatever. It is a fact. It is a fact which has existed for several thousand years.
In 1951, the Witchcraft Act was finally repealed, and throughout the following decade, numerous practitioners of magic began to surface. This, combined with the counterculture of the time, meant that numerous people were engaging with the idea of occult practices. This wasn't just murmurs about strange people in the countryside. There were identified covens, operating openly throughout the UK. Stories of moonlit naked dances in the forest began to filter into the public consciousness, but with it came a sense of unease and distrust. The general public wasn't familiar with terms like White Witch. To many, all occult practices were the work of evil, and those who believed in such things were in league with the devil. Even another village just a few miles from Clophill had a coven operating in it, according to the locals. So the idea of black magic, and even the idea of people performing black masses, was very much in the public consciousness. Reverend Barker one day in February received a strange phone call from a man who would not identify himself. He asked the Reverend if any occult rituals had ever been carried out in the church, which of course Barker said no such thing has ever taken place. Around the same time, numerous people in the village said a strange man who claimed to be a local reporter was asking a similar question, asking the locals if they were aware of any rituals taking place in the last few years in the area. Similar reports came from the nearby town of Amped Hill. It was a little odd, but these individual incidents were not connected until later. This brings us back to that early spring day in 1963. Reverend Barker received a knock on his door. It was the grooms. But they were accompanied by 2 children that he did not recognise. These 2 children were Duncan Stein and Calvin Smith, 2 boys from the nearby town of Luton, who had received bikes on Christmas Day, but due to the brutal winter, had not yet had a chance to use them. Aged only 12 and 13, the 2 boys cycled for miles, headed in the direction of Chick Sands Air Base. But along the way they passed through Clophill and found the path up to the old church that they had never visited before. Curious, they headed up to take a look at the place. They left their bikes on the grass and walked into the remains of the old church. They climbed a small barbed wire fence that offered little protection to the building and entered the ruins. The 2 boys must have felt a sense of shock at what they saw. Virtually in the middle of the church was an iron spike sticking out of the ground. Impaled on the spike was a human skull, missing its jawbone. Surrounding the spike was what looked like blood and chicken feathers, along with further human bones placed in a circle around the spike. A Celtic cross had been painted on the wall of the church. But the 2 boys clearly weren't fully aware of what they had stumbled on. Instead of running in terror, they picked up the skull and several of the bones and took them out into the graveyard, inspecting them as they sat and ate their lunch. Which was the moment the grooms found them and marched the boys straight down to the rector, convinced these boys had broken into a grave. Reverend Barker met the Bedford police at the top of the hill that led to the church before they went to take a look. It appeared the boys had been telling the truth. A large stone slab had been cleared of debris, and numerous human bones had been placed on it. The spike was there, seemingly a piece of the ironwork that had been pulled off the church. Numerous symbols were reported as having been drawn on the church walls, including the previously mentioned Celtic cross. Although interestingly, it appeared that another cross was on the wall next to it, albeit faded and weather-beaten, suggesting whoever had done this had been there before, likely at some point during the long winter. Outside in the graveyard, they found that numerous graves had been disturbed. 6 had been dug into, but due to being filled with rubble, the remains had not been excavated. But the 7th hadn't been so lucky. They belonged to a woman named Jenny Humberstone, a woman that had died in 1770 at the age of just 22. Seemingly the reason for the choice was purely chance. It took 4 policemen and the rector to pull the stone slab that covered her grave back into position, which caused an instant moment of revelation for both the police and the reverend. This was not the act of a single person, or a couple of teenagers. To do what had been done here required a considerable amount of effort and bodies. While it seemed like nothing like this had happened before, the Reverend did later admit that it wasn't the first time the graves had been interfered with. Over the past few years, there had been evidence of at least 3 attempts to dig up the graves of those buried at Old St Mary's Church, but they had largely been unsuccessful. Unsure what to do with the dug up remains, Reverend Barker locked them in a cupboard until he could arrange to have them reburied. The press soon descended on the sleepy little village of Clophill, and the narrative from both them and Reverend Barker was clear. This was the aftermath of black magic. Someone had used this old forgotten church as the site of a ritual. Some believed it was an act of mockery, a way to attack the Christian faith. But others saw it as an attempt at necromancy, the practice of summoning the dead in order to learn the future. Even the police released a statement shortly after the event, claiming they believed much the same. The press soon started referring to it as evidence that a black mass had taken place. On the Monday after the gruesome discovery was made, Reverend Barker went up to the old church with the Archdeacon of Bedford. The two men were having a conversation in the churchyard when they noticed a car pulling up towards the gate. Reverend Barker ignored it initially. The press and local onlookers had been coming up all hours of the day, so it didn't seem unusual. The driver walked towards them, and speaking in what Barker described as a foreign accent, he said he had heard about the incident and was interested in the subject of black magic. When Reverend Barker asked who the man was, he simply ignored the question and instead seemed to downplay the idea of a black magic ritual having taken place in Clophill. The strange man then said no more, walked around the church for a while, before getting into his car and driving away. An incident that chillingly echoed the strange visitor from the month prior. The following weekend on March the 23rd, Barker reburied Jenny's bones. The press were quickly losing interest, and the police were continuing their investigations quietly with little success. But on the Monday afternoon, Barker received another knock at the door. It had happened again. Less than 48 hours had passed and someone had dug up Jenny Humberstone's remains. Barker tried to downplay the event, claiming he believed a photographer had simply broken into the grave to get a photo. But again, the stone that lay over her grave was not an easy thing to move. It would require multiple men to do it. He decided again to hide the bones, until he could create a more permanent way to keep the grave safe. Despite the dying down of press interest, an ITV television crew appeared on Wednesday the 27th, wanting to cover the story for the show this week. The presenter of the segment, folklorist Eric Marple, recorded the segment in Jenny's open grave, climbing down a ladder to stand in it. Initially it seemed he was happy to do so, but he was later quoted as saying, "All the time we were there, I had this horrible feeling that something or somebody was watching over us. There was an atmosphere I can only describe as absolute evil, and I never want to go there again." This wasn't just showmanship from Marple though. He fainted during the recording. Twice. On Sunday the 31st, it seems those responsible struck again. Although when they this time dug up the grave to find it empty, they apparently set out to vandalise the gravestones. It was reported that Jenny Humberstone was reburied for a third time around this point, and seemingly for good this time, with 8 tons of soil poured to seal it. Although it appears this might have been a little bit of dishonesty from Reverend Barker, but we'll get into that in a little bit. It would be easy to dismiss this whole thing as the work of pranksters, or bored teenagers. Certainly a lot of the later events after the initial ritual could be blamed on them. For a long time afterwards, the church in Clophill became a hangout for young people, and the ruins and graveyard were vandalised on numerous occasions. But the initial incident that kicked this all off felt calculated. Someone had planned to do this. Someone had brought along multiple people to pull it off. And what was about to happen in the nearby village of Caddington was about to make all of this feel a lot more serious. The incident at Clophill was estimated by the authorities to have actually taken place on the 10th of March, the night of the full moon. The next time the moon was full, something equally troubling was discovered. It was Tuesday, the 9th of April, when authorities were called to an area that was known locally as Bluebell Wood, a series of 3 areas of woodland that run alongside the M1 motorway. In an incident that chillingly echoed the events in Clophill, just a few miles away, a couple of young boys were playing in the woods when they came across a grisly discovery. They found 2 circular clearings that had seemingly been created by trampling down the undergrowth. They were surrounded by dense bramble bushes. In the middle of one of the clearings was a tree. It was the smell that drew their attention at first, the powerful, overwhelming scent of death. Hidden throughout the bramble bushes that surrounded the clearing were the decapitated heads of 6 cows and a horse. Their eyes had been removed, their jaws had been pulled apart, with only the jawbones of 2 of the animals remaining, seemingly suggesting that whoever had done this had been interrupted before they could finish what they were trying to do. A member of the RSPCA who attended the scene later found one of the eyeballs dangling from a tree. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints. The cuts had been done almost surgically. The bodies of the animals were nowhere to be found. Quickly, the ritualistic elements of the circles and the placement of the eye were picked up on. But maybe not the other echoes of Clophill, the missing jaws, the circle of bones surrounding Jenny's skull mirroring the circles in the forest. While it's easy to connect the 2 incidents, there is also the comparison that some have made to the phenomena of cattle mutilations here, and the connection of that to the world of high strangeness. And this area of the country seemingly has its fair share of that. But we'll have to put a pin in that too for the moment. The following month, the community were prepared for the full moon, and patrols were set up to keep an eye on Old St Mary's Church. Sure enough, there was a large group of about 40 individuals up there that night. This later turned out to be students from a nearby college, leading to a written apology from the headmaster of the college. It seems by this point, Clophill had become firmly part of the local folklore, and countless young people were visiting late at night to have their own adventures, or more often than not to simply get drunk. This is where reports of people being spotted up on the hill become confused, because while there were reports of mostly young people messing around, there were also slightly more serious sounding reports of people up there, carrying torches, wearing robes, entering and leaving through the darkened fields, avoiding the roads. A few people did come forward, albeit anonymously, to claim their group were responsible for the incidents at Clophill, but none of their stories could be verified, and none seemed to provide any information that couldn't have been discovered through the press. Over the following year, numerous churches across the country reported what they referred to as black magic attacks, groups approaching priests with threatening messages, remains of rituals found in churches, effigies nailed into church doors. One incident in Sussex in December of 1963 led to a full-on fistfight between a group of priests, World War II veterans, and a group of occultists, who they found practicing in their church in the lead up to Christmas. In total, between 1963 and 1964, around 200 churches were found to have been defiled, robbed, or even burned. One more dark incident took place in the area during this time. While there is no direct link to the events, I think it's worth bringing up, just for us to have multiple disturbing accounts all taking place within a small rural area of the country, within the span of just a few months, is interesting. Just a short drive to the east of Clophill, you will find Henlow Grange, an English country house that is now run as a spa, but back in the 60s, also doubled as a health farm and beauty school. The dark side of this place is now mostly associated with being the location of at least one of Jimmy Savile's horrific crimes. But in 1963, the same year as the Clophill incident and the Bluebell Woods discovery, the body of a Californian man who had been the sole male student at the beauty school was found in an area of woodland nearby by a gardener. Or at least, his skeleton was. This was Russell Winterbottom, a wealthy 37-year-old man who had paid for a year's tuition at the school. One day he set off to go for a jog, wearing a tracksuit. Then he didn't come back. This was in early October. Police searched the area for him for some time, but no trace of the man could be found. That was until December the 3rd, where his remains were found next to an empty 2-gallon petrol can. A second 5-gallon one was found nearby, still full. The police's official report was that the man had set himself on fire, although seemingly no motive for this act was ever identified. No reports of a fire were spotted, and the police didn't find him during their search, despite him still being close to the school. The entire incident was odd. While the attention surrounding Clophill died down, it didn't end for Reverend Barker. Barker had become the focal point for anyone interested in Clophill, and in among the letters he had received on the subject, he was also receiving dark, rambling messages from those with a supposed interest in the dark arts. The old church was constantly being vandalised and visited by not just troublemakers, but those interested in the occult. The police did step in initially, but as time went on, many claimed that they instead seemed more interested in keeping people away from the area, so that those who were actually there to conduct rituals could continue in peace, as though they had decided that they couldn't stop it, so it was best to keep the general public at bay to avoid any further violent incidents. Jumping ahead a little here, a good example of this is the story reported by a man named Mick Peters, who made a visit to Clophill himself in 1975 with several friends. A group of bikers all wanting to see if there was any truth to the reports that on Halloween each year, a black mass is carried out at the old church. Of course, the group rocking up in the local area quickly got a lot of attention. When in one of the local pubs they asked about the church, the whole room apparently went quiet. Mick had first thought that the locals were playing along a little, when he noticed a lot of strange items being hung in the windows and above the doors of the pub, as though they were there for some sort of protection, feeling much like the opening of a Hammer Dracula movie. Still, Mick along with a few others headed up there. As they grew closer and closer, numerous members of the biker group fell back, not wanting to admit it, but growing increasingly fearful of stepping foot in the church grounds. By the time they reached the church, there were only 3 of them. But that didn't mean they were alone. They crept among the gravestones and could see the church was lit up. Through one of the entrances, they could see numerous people in there. Large black candles were scattered around. There were 2 women standing naked in the centre, with numerous others dressed in blue cloaks standing around them. He compared their clothing to that of a monk's habit. All of them were chanting, but they couldn't really make out what was being said. They decided to try their luck and get a little closer. Just moments after they did, the birds flocked out of the trees into the night sky, and all 3 men ducked in panic as they heard what they were convinced was the blast of a shotgun. This was all the warning the 3 men needed. They ran as fast as they could. If someone was actually shooting at them, or just trying to scare them away, they couldn't be sure. But it was clear, whoever these people were, they were serious. This wasn't a case of kids messing around with the occult. When they reached the bottom of the path, they found a number of police officers who had been clearly stationed there for Halloween. When they told the police what had happened, the officers told the men to clear off, that they had no right to be there. Later that night, a fire was lit in one of the tombs, and a number of gravestones were vandalised. Seemingly the police did not get involved. Mick returned the following day. Sure enough, there was the now familiar aftermath of a ritual, including what appeared to be numerous human bones scattered about, and something painted on the wall in Latin. In recent years, the message Mick saw has been translated by author Kevin Gates as saying, "Do not look." But back to the 1960s and Reverend Barker's plight. Money was constantly being sunk into repairs needed in the graveyard as vandals destroyed tombstones. Symbols and messages were sprayed on walls. Reverend Barker was not a young man, and the stress of all of this was really starting to get to him. Increasingly, people reported seeing the priest drunken, unshaven. The new church also began to have its own issues, and it seemed likely it would have to be demolished if significant money wasn't raised to repair it. The parish room of the new church was destroyed by a fire when the Reverend created a bonfire outside. Then, just a few years later, his daughter was hit by a car and killed. The Reverend slowly began to believe that he had been cursed. This was also the time that some rather troubling rumours began to circulate about the Reverend. It appeared he had been too scared to truly return Jenny Humberstone's bones to her grave. Instead, he had apparently kept them in the boot of his car, where they seemingly remained for years after the incident. Apparently later in life, he even took to showing off these bones in the pub in return for a free beer. Midsummer had become a regular time that large-scale incidents seemed to happen at the old church, and one year, Reverend Barker took it upon himself to stand vigil alone, feeling like no one else was interested in helping him anymore. For 3 nights he visited the church and waited, but there was no one. No cars, no visitors, no voices, just him and the gentle howl of the wind. On the final night he waited until around 3 AM before, exhausted, he decided to head back to the rectory and get some sleep. When he returned the following morning, 2 tombs had been opened and the skulls removed. Had they been there the entire time, watching him, waiting for the moment he would leave? Or was something else at play here? Something more otherworldly? The Reverend didn't know, but he was at his breaking point. He began to demand that the church be pulled down. The tombstones ended up being moved from the locations in the graveyard to the perimeter of the churchyard to stop any further excavations of the remains, which seemed to help, but the church remained standing. By 1969, the stress had become too much for Reverend Barker. After years of battling these seemingly unknown groups, he stepped down and agreed to retire. In a statement he put out at the time, he said that in the 7 years he had been in Clophill, not a month had gone by where the graves and tombs hadn't been dug up, or some kind of ritual performed. He moved out on Halloween of 1969. That night, countless young people from the surrounding area invaded the old church and held a Halloween celebration. If it had intended to be or not, this party marked the symbolic defeat of Reverend Barker. While the visitors on Halloween seemed to be mostly drunk teenagers, the remains of another ritual were found in the ruins of nearby Halton House. Yet again, the discovery was made by children playing in the ruins the following day. Black candles, a white circle painted on the floor, and a sheep's heart placed in the centre. It all felt very familiar. But this didn't mean it was over in Clophill either. Over the following years, numerous pieces of evidence of rituals were found. One excavation that took place in 1973 discovered numerous remains of birds buried in the ground inside the church, as well as a doll covered in what appeared to be magical symbols. Even the local American Air Force men who had been stationed in the nearby Air Force base of Chicksands were very aware of Clophill, sharing stories about the place, claiming to see oddly dressed people walking through the fields late at night. Although some of the locals were suspicious of the airmen, suggesting that they might be behind a lot of the activity. Conspiracies even started to be brought up that the base itself was connected to whatever was going on in Clophill in a more clandestine fashion, that the secretive base was in fact conducting some sort of experiment in this place that seemed to have a power to draw in a lot of different people. There were also UFO reports made over the area during the major period of the supposed occult activity in the 60s, but there is little evidence to connect the two. Reverend Barker moved to Hitchin, around 10 miles away. Seemingly this wasn't far enough. Just a few months after he had moved, the Reverend was out for a walk along a track that ran alongside his new home. There, he found an area of the ground had been cleared. An effigy had been built using stones, a fire had been burnt, and bones were scattered all around. In Reverend Barker's eyes, this wasn't someone messing with him. It was serious. Someone really was trying to curse him. Someone wanted him dead. Barker stayed for a while, but eventually decided that he needed to move much further from Clophill. He moved to Somerset and lived a life of obscurity for his remaining years. Not much is known about his time there, if he was truly free from whoever was tormenting him. But either way, he passed away in 1985. Around the same time, numerous residents in Clophill claimed to receive anonymous letters posted through their doors, covered in occult symbols. Seemingly these letters were a warning that all of the activity at Clophill needed to cease. It seemed to suggest that the locals were responsible, and if they didn't stop, things would turn bad. But by this point it seemed to most at least that the activity had stopped, or at least drastically decreased. Sure, there were reports of people up there late at night causing trouble, but they mostly started to fizzle out, and the apparent evidence of black magic rituals became few and far between. But that didn't mean that Clophill was free from the strange, because from the moment the Reverend left the area, a new phenomena seemed to spark up. The first documented report of a ghostly sighting in the area came just a few short months after Barker moved away, during the Christmas period of 1969. It was the early hours of the morning, when a local newsagent named Lawrence was out delivering papers with his wife. They were travelling on one of the lanes close to the church, when they saw a light in the distance that they assumed was a cyclist. But as they approached one another, he realised it was a man on a horse, carrying a lantern. They got closer still when Lawrence said he became convinced it looked like the man was dressed like a monk. But the couple didn't have long to process the strangeness of the situation, as it was about to take on another level. The man and the horse didn't move around the car, they simply passed through it. Lawrence, terrified, jammed his foot onto the accelerator and drove off as fast as they could, refusing to look back. They kept their story to themselves until 1 year later, when a local woman asked if on his deliveries he had ever spotted a strange man in a cloak riding a horse around the lanes in the early hours of the morning. An almost identical encounter was reported just 2 years later in nearby Chicksands Wood. At the actual church itself, there is said to be the ghost of a woman who is either called Sophie or Sophia. This story seems to begin in 1972 when a Luton-based ghost hunter captured a picture of what he believed to look like a ghostly woman standing behind his wife in one photo. Although the rumours of Sophia's ghost seemed to spread back further, it became easy to connect this story with the photograph when a tomb was discovered right under where the spectre in the photograph was said to have been standing, belonging to someone called Sophia. There have also been reports of similar hooded figures to that which was seen riding a horse being spotted in the ground too, although these could have been stories that have been muddled in with the occult practices. By the 90s, the evidence of occult rituals had pretty much all but died out, but rumours and ghost stories about the place still lingered, and it is still seen as a tourism destination for those into the strange and the dark, though alarms and security lights have long since been added to try and scare off any would-be nighttime visitors. Whatever really happened here it's hard to deny that Old St Mary's Church has its own power to it. The isolated ruin that was once so important to the community became a beacon for something that appeared to be much darker. A place of strangeness in an area you wouldn't expect it to exist. A careful reminder that you never know who or what is watching you from the shadows. So what did really happen? Normally this is the part of an episode where I try to weigh up all the possible explanations for a case, but I'm not sure there's much to cover here. These events really happened, and it was widely agreed that there was a level of effort and seriousness to the proceedings that seemed to suggest this wasn't merely the work of pranksters. But of course, once the stories got out to the wider public, Clophill became a destination for anyone with even the slightest interest in the unexplained in the area, so the stories quickly become muddled. What could have been genuine examples of actual rituals, and what was just bored teenagers messing around, becomes very muddy. The ghost story elements, though, are an interesting thing to play around with mentally. Most reports only started after the rituals were reported, and most interestingly to me, after the Reverend left the village. Was this just an example of stories like this springing up because more people were spending time up at the old church at night? Was it people wanting to make up stories to scare one another? Or, if you believe this sort of thing, did the rituals awaken something? Was the desecration of the graves responsible for disturbing the spirits? I also love the gentle background noise of conspiracy that seems to run through all of this too. Were the police really protecting the rituals? Were the Air Force doing something in the area the locals weren't supposed to know about? Neither of these elements really have too much meat to get into really, but they do add a whole additional creepy element to the story. But at the end of the day, I think you can put aside the otherworldly parts of this case, because to me this one is much more a human story. It's Reverend Barker's story, a damaged man sent to look after a damaged church, and forced to face something that, in his eyes, was evidence of evil. And unfortunately, as far as his story goes, that evil won. There is another thread to this story though, the mutilated remains of those animals in the forest. I intended to get into all of that as part of this episode, but this part of the tale takes us down a rabbit hole of some very strange stories indeed, centred around that location and the wider area. So I think this might have to be its own episode. I would love it if you could join me next time as we uncover the higher strangeness of Bluebell Wood. That's all for this entry into the tape library. I used a few different sources for this one, but my main one was undoubtedly The Paranormal Diaries Clophill by Kevin Gates. If you want to delve deeper into this subject, then I cannot recommend this book enough. Gates has done a fantastic job of providing as much information about the case as possible, and interviewing numerous people involved. I also want to point out 2 different friends of the channel have also covered Clophill, so if you want more then check out both Peter Law's and Don't Scare Claire's episodes on the church. This was another episode that was requested by a bunch of you when I asked at the start of the year, so thank you if you were one of those who asked for it. Felt like a very nice fit for this show while being something a little different. As I said, we'll be staying in Bedfordshire for the next episode in a couple of weeks' time, so this is going to be kind of a loose 2-parter. If you don't want to miss out on that, then please be sure to subscribe, and if you're listening to the podcast version, leaving me a 5-star rating is always a lovely way to support what I do. It's time to close up the archives for the night, but I will see you all very soon. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams. This episode was made possible by the kind donations from those on Patreon. First up are tape library archivists Shan Harding, Adam M, Edgar Allan Ho, Adam Grantham, The Magic Pumpkin, Lucas Wiles, Yenok, Aurora, Lee Borix Johnson, Now and Zem, Pat McShay, Pantherpaw, The Elusive M, Yoinks and Away, The Bisexual Moon Cult, Emulated Phoenix, Jamie Long, Lisa Mary Sheridan, Gaffy of a G, Plum Blossom, Gina Britton, Emily Carlin, Sarah Boyd, Thomas Boatwright, Stephen Lutman, Crystal E, West Virginia Vegetable Man, Dawn Swan, Tina S, Sean Miller, Juno, Joseph Condola, Jolly Jedi, Pixelina, Joe, The Crimson DM, The Detective, Jean Janine, Darla, Alfredo Sandoval, Midia Zabine, Dominic DeAngelis, Dagon Odorleg, Judith Hacker, Eric Salas, Mirashard, Adeline, Ashlars Books, Gabrielle Umaka Grimm, and Sandy Lusk. Then we have our amazing lead archivists, Wynne Lewis, Yvonne Rivers, Amy Stubblefield, The Original Deer, Emmy Bartley, Lady Bette Noir, Ridiculous, London Grace, Melissa Harrison, Emperor Franz, Old Soul Like Mine, Xavier Rangel, Sad Gal Callie, Alex O'Neill, Tyler Michael, Alex Goldberg, Van Yell, Brian Baker, and my thousandth ghost. And our insanely generous Grand Overseers, Harrison the Overlord, Leah Carmella, Bad Diddle, Katie, Morning Rain 2619, Agent 355, and Queen of Flatulence. Thank you to them, all of my junior archivists and my members on Patreon. Your support makes this show possible. If you want to join us over on Patreon, there's a few little perks and a chat that we often have conversations in. It's also where I normally first share any news about the channel. Links to all of that can be found in the description. Thank you.